Have you ever delayed an important task because you told yourself you were simply waiting for the right mood, the right energy, or the perfect spark of inspiration? We constantly treat our negative emotions like red traffic lights, believing that anxiety, doubt, or exhaustion are signs from the universe telling us to stop and wait. If you are paralyzed by the need to feel perfectly ready before you begin, this story will shatter that illusion. Stay with me until the end. There is a quiet lie most people live with, and it doesn't sound dangerous. It sounds reasonable. It tells you that today isn't the right day, not because you can't act, but because something feels off. Your energy is low, your mind is restless, your chest carries a weight you can't quite explain. So you wait, believing that delay is wisdom, and in that moment it feels justified. You tell yourself you're being patient, not avoiding, that you're preparing, not hesitating. But something subtle begins to happen beneath that logic. Each time you wait, you reinforce a silent belief. That action requires the right feeling first. And tomorrow never arrives the way you expect. It comes with the same doubts, the same heaviness, the same quiet resistance. Only now, there's something more. The weight of yesterday's delay. And so you wait again, hoping for clarity, for confidence, for a version of yourself that finally feels ready. But that version keeps moving further away. Let me ask you something. How many days have passed while you were waiting to feel ready? Not dramatic losses, just ordinary days that could have been something more, if you had begun anyway. Because the truth is, lost time rarely feels like loss. It feels like caution. It feels responsible. It feels right. That's what makes it dangerous. We've been taught to treat emotions like signals we must obey. Anxiety means stop. Doubt means reconsider. Exhaustion means wait, as if every uncomfortable feeling is a command instead of something temporary passing through you. But what if that's not true? What if anxiety isn't a red light, but just weather? What if you've been standing still, waiting for a signal that was never meant to control you? Because there are people who feel the same fear, the same doubt, and still move forward. Not because they feel ready, but because they understand something most people don't. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But before that truth becomes clear, you need to see what happens when waiting becomes a way of life, not in theory, but in a story. A story about a man who stood at the edge of his future and kept telling himself, tomorrow. In a forgotten kingdom surrounded by jagged mountains, there lived a warrior named Caleb, known for discipline and quiet strength rather than reckless courage. He was the kind of man others trusted to move forward when paths became uncertain, and yet there was one path he could not take. At the edge of his homeland stood a narrow pass, swallowed by thick, unmoving fog. Beyond it lay the Eastern Realm, a place where purpose was said to become clear, and Kalen believed with certainty that his destiny waited there. Each morning he approached with steady steps and a prepared mind, but the moment he reached the threshold, something shifted inside him. A tightness formed in his chest. His thoughts lost their clarity, and a quiet unease settled over him, subtle, but enough to stop him. He did not question it. Instead, he gave it meaning. He told himself that a warrior should not step forward while unsettled, that waiting was not avoidance but wisdom, and that when the right moment came, it would feel unmistakable. And so, with calm reasoning that felt almost disciplined, he turned back. At first, this choice strengthened his sense of control because he filled his time with preparation, training harder, refining his skills, sharpening his blade. But there was one thing he never practiced: taking the first step. Days folded quietly into weeks, and what began as a decision slowly became a pattern. Each morning followed the same rhythm, not because the world had changed, but because his interpretation of it had not. The fog remained the same. The clarity he waited for never arrived. And still, he returned, only to stop again, until one morning, something unfamiliar caught his attention. The ground before the pass was marked with footprints, many of them, layered and overlapping, all leading forward and stopping at the same place. As his gaze lifted, he noticed what he had somehow overlooked before. Scattered across the valley were old camps worn by time, surrounded by abandoned weapons and faded armor. And among them stood men who looked no different from him, trained, capable, and completely still, their eyes resting on the fog, with a patience that no longer felt intentional. They were waiting. The realization settled slowly but firmly. These men had come to cross, just as he had. Yet something had kept them here, holding on to the belief that one day they would feel ready. When Kalen approached one of them and spoke of waiting for fear to disappear, the man finally turned and answered with a quiet certainty that carried no comfort at all. That day doesn't come. The words lingered, heavier than the silence that followed. And as Kalen looked around at what had once been a place of intention, something inside him began to fracture. Not his fear, but his belief in what that fear meant. Because for the first time, he understood that this was not a place of preparation. It was a place where warriors came to wait and never left. Kalen did not leave the valley that day. He remained at the edge of the pass, yet something within him no longer stood as firmly as before, as though the ground beneath his certainty had begun to soften in ways he could not fully explain. The words he had heard lingered in his mind, not loud, not forceful, but steady enough that he could not return to the comfort of ignoring them. If the feeling never disappears, then what am I waiting for? The question did not bring clarity, but it disrupted something deeper. The quiet agreement he had made with his own fear, the belief that it was something to obey rather than something to understand. For the first time, he began to observe what he felt instead of immediately accepting it as truth. The tightness in his chest remained. The unease still moved through him. But now, it no longer felt like a command. It felt like weather. And just as that realization began to take shape, he noticed movement in the distance. A man was walking toward the pass. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him, until Kalen saw the way he moved, not with the awareness of someone navigating a visible path, but with careful, measured steps. One hand resting lightly against the stone as if it were guiding him forward. As the man drew closer, the truth became clear. He could not see. Kalen stepped forward instinctively, a quiet urgency rising within him, not from fear of the path, but from disbelief at what he was witnessing. "Stop!" he called out, his voice controlled but firm. "You don't understand what lies ahead." The traveler paused, turning slightly toward the sound, his expression calm in a way that did not come from certainty, but from something more grounded. "There is nothing to understand," he said. Kalen frowned, struggling to reconcile the man's calm with the reality of the pass. "The path is dangerous," he replied. "You cannot see where you are going. Don't you feel it? The fear, the hesitation." The man remained still for a moment, as if considering the question not to answer it, but to acknowledge it. "I feel it with every step," he said quietly. The answer unsettled Kalen more than denial would have. "Then why continue?" he asked, his voice tightening slightly. "Why walk into something that makes you hesitate?" The traveler's expression did not change, but there was a softness in his presence, as though he had already made peace with something Kalen was still resisting. "Because hesitation is not a wall," he said. "It is only a sensation that passes through me." The words did not strike like force. They settled. Kalen stood still, watching as the man resumed his slow movement forward, his hand tracing the rough surface of the rock, his steps steady despite the visible tremor in his fingers. There was no illusion of fearlessness in him, no sign that he had mastered the feeling Kalen struggled with. If anything, he seemed more affected by it, and yet he did not stop. "I do not wait for the fear to leave," the traveler continued as he walked. "If I did, I would remain here forever. The fear does not block the path. It only walks beside me." Kalen felt something shift within him, not all at once, not in a way that brought relief, but in a way that made it impossible to return to what he believed before. Because the man was not overcoming fear. He was moving with it. And in that quiet distinction, something began to unravel inside Kalen's understanding. The feeling he had treated as a signal to stop no longer appeared as something solid, something absolute, but as something fluid, something temporary, like wind that could be felt but never held. As the traveler approached the edge of the pass, his pace remained unchanged, guided not by confidence, but by willingness. He did not search for a moment when the trembling would disappear, nor did he attempt to silence it. He simply continued, step by step, allowing the feeling to exist without allowing it to decide. Kalen watched him closely, his attention no longer fixed on the fog, but on the space within himself, where choice still remained. For the first time, that space became visible, not wide, not easy to step into, but undeniably present, and within it, a possibility emerged. That perhaps he had never been held back by fear itself, but by the meaning he had attached to it. The traveler did not stop at the edge. Without hesitation, not because he felt none, but because he no longer required its absence, he stepped forward and allowed the fog to take him, disappearing into the unknown with the same quiet steadiness he had carried from the beginning. Kalen remained where he was, but not as the same man, because although the fear within him had not faded, its authority had. And as that shift settled into place, the path before him no longer felt closed, but something that had always been open, waiting not for a different feeling, but for a different decision. Kalen remained at the edge of the pass long after the traveler had disappeared, his gaze fixed on the place where the fog had swallowed him. And as though expecting something in the world outside to confirm what had already begun to change within him. Yet nothing answered him. The wind moved as it always had. The mist remained dense and silent, and the path revealed no new certainty. And still, everything felt different. The fear had not left him. It lingered in his chest with the same quiet weight, rising and falling with each breath, unchanged in its presence, but altered in its meaning. It no longer felt like a command that demanded obedience, but something closer to a passing condition, real, undeniable, yet no longer in control. For a moment he stood between two versions of himself, one shaped by waiting, and the other just beginning to understand that waiting had never been required. The distance between them was not measured in strength, but in interpretation. Slowly, Kalen lowered his gaze and noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the same trembling he had once taken as proof that he was not ready. This time, he did not resist it, did not attempt to steady himself or force calm where it had not yet arrived, because he no longer believed that stillness was a prerequisite for movement. Instead, he allowed the feeling to exist. And in that allowance, the tension within him began to change, not by disappearing, but by losing the resistance that had once amplified it. When he finally stepped forward, there was no surge of confidence, no sudden clarity that justified the action. The fog remained thick, the uncertainty unchanged, and the discomfort still present. Yet the step happened anyway, carried not by how he felt, but by a quiet decision that no longer depended on it. As he continued into the pass, each movement followed the last with a steadiness that did not come from certainty, but from acceptance. The unease remained beside him, rising and falling like a shifting current. Yet it no longer stood in front of him as something to overcome. It moved with him, present but no longer defining his direction. With each step, his attention narrowed, drawn away from imagined outcomes and into the immediate rhythm of movement itself. The mind that once scattered under uncertainty now settled into something simpler, something grounded in the act of continuing rather than the need to feel ready. And within that rhythm, something subtle began to unfold. The fear did not vanish, but it receded, no longer occupying the center of his awareness, but existing quietly at its edges. The fog, which once felt like an impenetrable barrier, now revealed itself as something he could move through, step by step, without needing to see beyond it. Time passed without measure, until the air itself seemed to shift, growing lighter in a way that could be felt before it was seen. Gradually, the mist began to thin, not as a reward for courage, but as a consequence of movement, revealing fragments of the path ahead that had always been there. Kalen slowed, not from hesitation, but from realization. The clarity he had been waiting for had never been a condition to begin. It had been something that emerged only after he did. Kalen did not remain at the edge for long, because once something within him had shifted, standing still no longer felt like preparation, but something closer to resistance that no longer made sense. So he continued forward through the thinning fog, no longer waiting for his mind to become clear, and no longer measuring his readiness by the absence of discomfort. The path revealed itself gradually, not in certainty, but in small fragments that were enough for him to continue, and for the first time, that was all he required. The fear within him had not disappeared, nor had the uncertainty fully dissolved, yet neither of them held the same authority they once did, because they were no longer treated as conditions that needed to be resolved before action could begin. As he walked, his attention settled into the quiet rhythm of movement itself, where each step created just enough clarity for the next, and what once filled his awareness slowly receded into the background. The storm within him still moved, rising and falling without warning, but it no longer stood in front of him as something to obey, only beside him as something to carry. By the time he reached the end of the pass, the fog had lifted, revealing a vast horizon that had always been there, waiting beyond the place where he had chosen to stop. And standing there without the need for dramatic realization, Kalen understood something that felt almost too simple to have taken so long to see. He had not needed to become fearless, nor had he needed to eliminate doubt before moving forward. He had only needed to stop waiting for permission from what he felt. My friend, this story is about you. You have stood at your own edge more times than you can count, quietly telling yourself that you will begin when your energy returns, when your mind settles. Or when the hesitation finally fades into something easier to carry. But what you have been waiting for was never meant to lead you, because emotions are not instructions, and they were never designed to decide the direction of your life. They were designed to keep you safe, and if followed without awareness, they will always guide you back to what is familiar, still and unchanged, no matter how much you want something more. So if there is anything worth carrying with you from this story, let it be this quiet shift in understanding. First, learn to separate action from emotion so that what you do is no longer controlled by how you feel in the moment, and movement becomes something you choose rather than something you wait to feel. Second, learn to move with discomfort instead of waiting for it to disappear, understanding that its presence does not prevent progress, but avoiding it always will. And third, recognize that discipline is not something that arrives as a feeling, but something that is decided quietly and repeatedly, especially in the moments when the feeling is not there to support you. Because the path in front of you has never been closed, and the moment you stop treating your emotions like signals that control your direction, you will begin to see what has always been there, not all at once, but enough to take the next step, and then the next. Until clarity is no longer something you search for, but something you arrive at through movement. And before you leave, take a moment to be honest with yourself, not in a distant or abstract way, but in something immediate and real. What is one thing you have been waiting to feel ready for? Not tomorrow, not someday, but today. Hold that answer clearly, and if this story stayed with you, write it down below, not as a performance, but as a quiet commitment to yourself. Something that turns intention into action the moment you decide it matters. And when that moment comes, as it always does, you will not need to feel ready. You will only need to remember what you already understand and take the step anyway.